All right, so let's continue our walkthrough of Jonah chapter 1, starting in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." So Jonah's on the ship, sailing far west, in the opposite direction of God's redemptive purposes, and God makes it clear that he won't allow it. The scene that follows is dramatic and instructive. The mariners are crying out, each to a different God. The captain instructs Jonah to do the same, but he does not. The one thing we have to do when we are seeking his will and our path forward guided by him, Jonah refuses to do. Because he already knows what God wants him to do. Sometimes we may find ourselves in a mess of our own making. And even though we may know our way out, we may pray for some other way. Jonah doesn't seem to see the point of that. He does not pray. Picking it up in verse 7. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots. We may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and that lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. The difference in reaction between Jonah and the sailors to the event that's transpiring is noticeable. They're desperate for a solution, actively seeking a way of rescue from their predicament. And then there's Jonah, passively experiencing the entire situation. It takes the casting of lots to point the finger at him, which results in many questions sent his way. Jonah says, "I fear the Lord," yet the sailors were described as exceedingly afraid. Jonah seems to be paying mere lip service, whereas the men of the boat are actually terrified at the idea that the God who created the sea specifically was being disobeyed while they were vulnerable on said sea. The ridiculousness of Jonah's actions scream at the reader from the perspective of the sailor's response. Does Jonah actually fear the Lord? What incredible tension this highlights between things we know, things we really know. Why would such a person act this way? The mystery is yet to be explained to us. The question, rhetorical in this case, is highlighted again by the men who fear for their lives. What is this that you have done? There's a proper orientation to God. I like to think of the word worship as a single word that encompasses this orientation idea. But fear, reverence, submission, love, and service are all wrapped up in this concept. Proper orientation to God looks a certain way, and it produces a certain kind of fruit. Think of John 15, paraphrasing, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing, but in me, you bear much fruit." There's not a lot of good we can do, quote unquote, for God without the proper orientation to God. This dramatic tale is highlighting the confluence of clear calling from God with improper orientation. And it always results in some form of judgment and discipline to produce reorientation, as we will soon see. All this is pointing to the satirical nature of the writing, and the layers of satire mount as we continue to read because the pagans show this proper orientation without knowing God the way Jonah does throughout the entire story. We must ask ourselves, are we oriented properly to God? If this encounter on the boat were reduced to metaphorical types and characters, which would we resemble more, Jonah or the sailors? Verse 11, "Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?' For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. They are seeking a solution, while Jonah seems resigned to die for what he has done. God is more than simply a just God, though, isn't he? And he's clearly not without a sense of humor, though no one on the boat found anything amusing about what was transpiring. What happens next is even more remarkable. The men don't go for Jonah's solution of throwing him into the sea. They value his life and are still looking for a solution that doesn't involve what Jonah suggested. And their logic makes sense. We will take you back to land so you can complete the calling of the Lord. Let's go east. Let's go back. As a mariner myself, I find the next bit intriguing. Quoted, "Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land. They could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them." Did the wind change directions? This happens in particularly violent storms as the low pressure point swiftly passes by the position of your ship or boat. And it's truly a nightmarish situation because the waves that are formed from the wind in one direction are now made steeper, less stable, more likely to break if they're acted upon by wind from the opposite direction. And when they break, that's usually when bad things happen because your boat's no longer going up and over the waves, it is being hit by them. The men are now trapped. They have nowhere to turn. They call out to Jonah's God. Verse 14, "Therefore they call out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you.' So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." These men seem to have a few things straight, don't they? They're concerned about justice. They fear the God of heaven and earth and cry out to him in distress. They're aware of potentially being found guilty by God for saving themselves by throwing Jonah overboard. They feared the Lord exceedingly. They offered sacrifices and made vows. Do we see the satire, the irony? What if Jonah had started out this way and wrestled with God in a similar fashion? Why does God's prophet show up this way in this account while the pagans appear to play the role of God-fearing men? Could the author be making a particular point we're supposed to pay attention to here? All of this foreshadows the dramatic ending we will soon read, but it also adds detail and texture to how Jesus invokes the entire story when he's asked for a sign. And he says, "None will be given except the sign of Jonah." Now, we can't jump too far ahead here because the response of the Ninevites is part of the completion of what Jesus points to. However, in my attempts to write about this and talk about it, I want to introduce it ahead of time so we can see as it unfolds what Jesus does with this sign of Jonah response is truly a remarkable reversal from what he was being asked. The author of the book of Jonah has just begun to unveil the thematic depth of where he is taking us.